What's up everyone, my name is Deltlead and today we're going to be kicking off a new series on the channel, one that I've been intending to get around to for a while. And the background of this is that the very first set of videos that I uploaded to the channel when I first started making YouTube content was a tutorial series for Simple Rockets 2. At the time, there wasn't a tutorial series out there, and I felt it would be a good thing to work on, a good thing to add to the community, because there wasn't any tutorials out there for new players. So I made a series of what ended up being 20 videos over the course of my YouTube channel's history, and looking back at them, they really aren't very good. This was back when I was very first learning how to video edit. I was working on my old laptop using free recording software, free editing software, and I really didn't know what I was doing and how to make the kind of high quality and informational content that I can now. So with the update finally bringing Simple Rockets 2 into 1.0, and with the name change from the old Simple Rockets 2 to Juno New Origins, I felt that now would be the best time to restart that tutorial series and go back and hit the things that I think I could have done a lot better the first time if I had the skills now that I did then. So we're going to kick off this new tutorial series, and the first topic we're going to be talking about are the basic controls for building a rocket. Now, the way Juno New Origins rocket editor works is it is a completely drag and drop system. So on PC, you just use the mouse to click and move around the space, left click and drag to rotate the screen, right click and drag to pan the screen, and that's it. That's how you move the camera around the space, and you can move around what you're working on. Another thing that is a very useful tip or trick is that if you are trying to focus on a part, let's say I'm working on this pod over here, if I double click on it, it brings it into the center of focus, so that now when I click and drag around, I'm orbiting around the object that I double clicked. I can do this for any object just by double clicking on them. I am now focused on that object, and I can right click and drag to move away from that object. So that's a quick way. If you need to work on a part, you want to zoom in on it really quick, you can just double click on it. So now the next thing is our active tool. So right now I have the move part tool. What the move part tool lets me do is if I left click on space, I move the camera, but if I left click on a part and drag, I actually grab that part and any part connected to it in the chain. So the way the chain works is you have a command pod or some sort of center point on your craft. Now right now that is this space capsule right here. This is the root part for my whole craft. So if I grab any other part that's connected to it, those parts come off of it. If I grab the root part itself, the whole thing moves around the space. And when I grab a part, any part that's connected to it that isn't connected to the root will go with it. For instance, if I grab this fuel tank, the engine connected to the fuel tank will move with it, so I can move entire chunks of my rocket around. The next tool that is worth talking about is the translate tool. Now the translate tool lets us move an individual part through space in both the X, Y, and Z directions, all three spaces in our 3D building environment. There's a couple things worth noting over here. There's the grid size, and this goes for the move tool as well, that there is a grid size option. So the grid size is literally the base units of movement that I can have it here. So this is 0.25 or 25 centimeters, 1/4 of a meter, and you can see it moves in chunks. I can make that all the way to 1 meter, and it moves 1 meter at a time like that, or I can make that 0, and it moves continuously with no snap to the grid. Most people like to have it at 5 centimeters. 5 centimeters is a good happy balance. It gives you fine control, but it also allows you to align things up on a grid. 10 centimeters is also pretty common, but I usually leave this at 5 centimeters or 0.05 meters. The next thing is the mode. So you can move connected, which means if I were to grab this fuel tank and it's set to connected, it is going to move the fuel tank and all parts connected to the fuel tank through the root. So the fuel tank's connected to the space capsule, which is our root. We have our engine here. If I click and drag when it's connected, it moves everything attached to the fuel tank, not including the space capsule. I can also have it just be self, which ignores any part connections. So now I can move the fuel tank without moving the engine. And then we also have direction. So there is local and there is world direction. So world direction is X, Y, and Z in the working environment. But let's say I have a fuel tank here, and let's say I rotate it so it's at an angle to the other fuel tank here. Now if I go to the translate tool and it's set to world, you'll see these sliders are the same between the two tanks. Now if I take it to local, you'll see that the sliders are now aligned to the tank, so it can move in the direction of its angle, perpendicular, parallel to the angle that I rotated the tank. So that can be good if you're moving things around in the space that are not lined up all in the same direction. If you've got things that are rotated, you can change the translate mode between local and world. Next up is the rotate part tool. So the rotate part tool lets you do just that. You can rotate parts in space. It is very similar to the translate part. You have mode, connected, and self, which does the exact same thing, and you have direction, world, and local. You also have an angle step. So the translate tool had a grid step measured in meters. The rotate tool has a similar thing, but in degrees. So I can have this set to 0, and now it moves continuously through the 360 degrees of rotation. Or I can set this to be 15 degrees, which is the default, and now it snaps in 15-degree increment. Also, with the translation and rotation tools at the very bottom here, it shows you the specific part properties. So for the translate tools, it gives you the actual coordinates of the part, and you can see those coordinates change as I move the part around space. The same goes for the rotate tool. If I rotate a part, you'll see the angle change in each of the 3 directions, and this allows you to specifically edit the angle directly without touching the sliders. All right, the next tool in our toolbox, and probably the most complicated and most difficult to explain, is the part shape tool. Now, if I go to just the move part tool, you'll see that there is a blue arrow on the top and bottom of the fuel tank and an orange arrow here on the side. Now, these will let me change the basic properties of the fuel tank. If I move this engine here, you'll also see green arrows on the bottom, and if I take this engine all the way off, bottom and top. Now, as you would expect, when you move these arrows, you expand or change the dimensions of the fuel tank in the direction or dimension of that arrow in a pretty self-explanatory manner. Now, this is a very effective way to change fuel tank properties without overcomplicating it, but sometimes you need a very specific shape that you're going for, and that is where the part shape tool comes into play. What the part shape tool allows you to do is edit 3 different parts of every fuel tank. You can edit either face, so in this case the bottom of the fuel tank and the top of the fuel tank, as well as properties in the middle of the fuel tank. Now, the properties in the middle include things like the length. You can also change the offset. For instance, I can make this fuel tank slanted in either the X or the Z direction. I can also change the pinch or slant of the fuel tank. Now, the pinch of the fuel tank basically gives it a teardrop shape. It pinches one side of the fuel tank, and the slant effectively makes a wedge on the end of the fuel tank. Now, this is useful for a variety of different shapes if you're trying to get very specific things. On the faces, we have several different properties we can change. We can change the width of the tank, so instead of a circle, we can make it an oval or an ellipse. We can also change the radius of the circle here. So if you leave it at 100%, it will be a circle, but if I were to take these sliders all the way down, I actually create a square. And so you can smoothly transition between circle and square using these sliders. And you can do it for individual corners as well. So I could have 1 or 2 corners be a square. And if I were to replicate the same thing on the bottom of this fuel tank, you would see that I have now a fuel tank that is flat on one side, round on the other. And that's useful for a lot of different designs. Maybe you want a side booster that is flush with the fuel tank, and so you want it to be flat on one side and rounded on the other. And that's about all there is to it with the part shape tool. Again, you have the grid size here as well, and it works in the same way. If I increase the grid size, it increases the increments in which I change things. The part shape tool also has these sliders here that allow me to move things in space, but instead of moving the entire diameter of the tank, it moves one part in one dimension. So I can make a slanted fuel tank like this very easily just by moving the slider to and from. Alright, the next tool worth talking about is the paint tool. Now, the paint tool is exactly what you would think it is. It is a paintbrush. Now, we have a palette here that we are able to select from, and we can select each of these individual colors and see their properties. This is the default palette, so you have these colors arranged. If you start a new rocket, new plane, this is always going to be your default palette, but there are actually customized color palettes you can switch from up here at the top. You can also customize any of the colors in these palettes. Simply select one of the boxes here in your palette, and you can change the base color, you can change the luminosity of that color, and you can change properties like the smoothness. Maybe you want a brass or a gold color for some of the parts on your rocket. Maybe you want it to have a very metallic finish. For lights, you can actually have its emission go up, which makes it emit light. or you can increase and decrease the detail. You can also make parts transparent, which is useful for glass and other things. And our last tool that we have in our toolbox is the parts connection tool. Now this allows you to see the attachment points for every part in your build space and where they're connected to. It also allows you to manually attach things together. So the way it works is if I select a part, you'll see each of the different attachment points. The bottom of the space pod, top of the space pod, the bottom shell, which I'll get into later. Inside the actual part for the crew capsule here, there's an astronaut and the surface of the capsule. Now we see on this space capsule, on the bottom we have the fuel tank here, the top we have the parachute, and the bottom we have the fuel tank shell. If I select or click on any of these here, it takes me to that part. So I can use the part connections tool to work my way through my craft build. If I have a lot of parts that are connected together, I can basically chase them using this and work my way around the craft to find maybe a specific root part that is connected at the very base, or something that's buried and hidden away that I can't access easily just by clicking and dragging, which makes it very useful. The other very useful thing you can do is disable certain connection. Now, let's say I don't want to connect anything to the bottom of this fuel tank here. Well, I can disable the bottom connection points here. Now, if I were to say take a interstage part and try and connect it to the fuel tank, you'll see it no longer snaps there. It no longer wants to be connected to the bottom of the fuel tank. The other thing that the part connections tool is useful for is I can manually assign connections between different parts. For instance, let me take the main fuel tank on our rocket here. I'll add a new connection to the rotate part of the fuel tank. I can then select another part that's not connected yet, and I can select what connection point I want to add to our and I can select what connection point I want to connect these two fuel tanks. For now, we'll just connect both of their surfaces together. Now, even though they're not touching, I have connected these two fuel tanks together, and you can see them move in space as though they are connected. Now, that about does it for all the basic controls, but there are still a lot more tabs here on the side of our menu. We have the Add Part tab. Now, this pulls up all the different part menus that we can add to our craft. The top one is our command parts. So, command parts include the command chip, command disk, all of our capsules, as well as the astronaut's seat, the cockpit, and the space habitat and the crew compartments. Basically, it's anything that you can put on the rocket that you can control the rocket from, or allows you to store pilots and astronauts on your craft. The next tab is our structural tab. These are all the parts that make up the structure of your rocket. Things like fuel tanks, struts, cargo bays, inner stages, fairings, structural panels, blocks, you name it. All of these things can be found in this tab here. Next, we have our propulsion tab, or our engine tab. This is all of the engines available to us in the game. From our rocket engines to our ion engines, our jet engines, and our air inlets for our jet engines. All of these things can be found in this tab. Next, we have electronics, which is everything that either uses power or creates power for our craft. These things include solar panels, fuel cells, radioisotope thermal generators, lights, pistons, rotators, hinges, electric motors, gauges, switches, cameras, and multifunction displays. Anything that is a electronic or creates electricity or uses electricity will be found in this tab. Next, we have our control and descent tab. Now, this is the last of the stock tabs in the game, and these are all the parts that are used for landing our rocket, landing our airplane, anything that's used in helping it land safely on the ground or controlling it in flight. This includes parachutes, wings, gyroscopes, reaction control systems, heat shields, landing legs, and wheels. You can find all these parts here. And the last thing we have in our Add Parts menu that is part of the stock game is our subassemblies. Now, subassemblies allow you to create groupings of parts that you want to reuse later on. For instance, let's say I want to continue to use this fuel tank and engine combination. If I click and drag this combination of parts, you'll see in the top left corner of the screen is a Create Subassembly option. If I drop it in the subassembly box, I can then create a new subassembly. We'll call this one Fuel Tank and Engine. Now that adds it to my library of subassemblies, and I can go and find it again. Here it is, Fuel Tank and Engine. Click and drag, and I have an exact copy of the subassembly I dragged in there. This is very convenient if you've made a combination of parts that you want to reuse multiple times, either in the same build or in different builds. It's a very convenient way to simplify your work. Next, we have one of the most important tabs in the game, and that is the part properties. Now, the part properties tab allows you to do a deep dive into an individual part and change all of its different features. This is what makes all the parts procedural. When I click here, I've got different options for this fuel tank. It shows me the mass, the price. I can do things like add or remove dead weight, change the amount of fuel I want to store in there, change the type of fuel. I can change things like the auto resize feature and the seamless edge feature. I can also go down here and do things like change the style of the part. I can change the texture. I can change whether it's striped or not, and I can do things like tiling these textures. There's also additional settings that some parts might have, like enabling fuel lines if I want fuel to flow through different parts to my engine. There's so many different types of parts in Juno New Origins that to try and explain how the part properties tab relates to all of them would take way too long, so I'm not going to be doing that for every different part. Suffice to say that there is a lot of different options you can use to control all the different parts in the game. The next tab in the Craft Designer is the Symmetry tab. This Symmetry tab allows you to clone parts around a given axis or plane depending on the mode you're using. Right now, the symmetry is disabled, so I have this fuel tank here attached to the side of my rocket, and it's just the individual fuel tank. Now, without enabling symmetry, it's just going to remain there as an individual fuel tank, which is very asymmetrical for our rocket. But if I were to go up here and select mirror, now what I can do is go to the mode here and change it from disabled to mirror. Now that creates a second fuel tank mirrored along a plane that we can see here in the builder. Now I can grab these fuel tanks and I can move them around the center fuel tank, and you can see it mirrors the location of the first fuel tank around the middle of that fuel tank. The other type of mode we have for symmetry is radial symmetry, and this comes in a lot of different flavors. For instance, we have radial 2, which just flips or basically creates a second copy on the opposite side of the craft. Radial 3, 4, 5, 6, and back to disabled again. So you can have a lot of... This allows you to clone a part around a given fuel tank and makes it a lot easier to make very symmetrical and clean looking rockets. We can also break symmetry once we've created things, so I can break the symmetry here. Now when I move parts around, it doesn't impact all the parts, it just impacts the one that I am moving around in space. The next tab in the Craft Designer is our Pre-Flight Configurations tab. Now this tab has 3 sub-tabs under it that are all very important, and it allows us to look at a lot of very useful data for our craft. The first one, and probably the most important one, is our staging editor. Staging is the sequence in which parts are activated in a flight. Our first stage here activates the engine, and then our second stage activates the parachute once we're out of fuel at the top. Now there's a couple of very important buttons here. First, we can add stages. If we want to add parts and then we want to add a stage to make the sequence longer, we can do that. There's also a reset stage part. If we get a little confused with everything, we can just hit reset stages, which brings them all back to their defaults. We have the auto stage button, which basically gives the computer permission to try and guess where it thinks all the different rocket engines should be placed in the staging sequence. Now this can be pretty accurate at times, but it is known to have some issues. I usually leave this disabled when I'm working. Now the last button is also very useful. This shows us the delta V in each stage and the total delta V at the top here. So we can see this stage here has 4.59 kilometers per second of delta V. It shows us our thrust to weight ratio. It shows us the burn time. All the relevant data right here is available, and it shows the total craft delta V here at the top. The next tab is our activation groups tab. Now the activation groups are a way of basically binding specific actions to your buttons 1 through 0 on the keyboard or just on the screen. You can see most of these activation groups are not being used right now, but we do have a couple of default activation groups that are included in the in any stock craft that you're working on. Landing gear, solar panels, and reaction control systems. And these are defaulted landing gear and reaction control systems to be on or deployed at the start of any rocket. Now you can change things like their initial status by just clicking on these tabs here. You can also rename them to be whatever you want them to be. You can also create new activation groups. Now you'll see these activation groups are grayed out. That means that there are no parts assigned to that activation group and it doesn't have a name. But I can create an activation group by typing a name in, and then if I go to a part and go to its part properties, you'll see an activation group option here. Now I can move through all the different activation groups and assign this part to an activation group. Now when I go back here, if I enable this, that engine will be enabled at the start of the game. And lastly, we have the craft validation tab. Now this is useful for pointing out any problems that you might encounter with your craft. For instance, if I were to change the fuel type of this fuel tank so that it doesn't match the engine, and then I go down to craft validation, you'll notice that it says the engine here is missing a Carlock source. Basically, the craft validation is noticing that there is no fuel for that engine, and then that engine is not going to work. This is a very good tab to check right before you're about to launch to make sure you haven't forgotten anything and that everything is going to work as anticipated. Next is our search parts tab. This basically gives you a drop-down list of all the parts in a craft, and let's say you have named a specific part, you can type that part's name in and find the part you're looking for right there. You can also hide parts, which can be useful if you're trying to find a part that's buried inside a bunch of other parts. You can hide all the parts and then highlight the one you're looking for. Lastly, we have our view options panel. Now, our view options gives us a couple of things. Probably the most important three here are our center indications. Now we have our center of mass, center of lift, and center of thrust. These are easily the most important three things in this page. This allows us to highlight very important things like the center of gravity, especially when we're building planes and we want to make sure that our center of mass and center of lift are balanced properly. Very important tools here. We also have a couple of basic camera options. We can have it look at the front of the craft, from the side, or from the top and bottom. Other things worth noting is that we can look at our lift vectors. By enabling this, it shows me the vector or the direction which that wing is going to generate lift, which is very good, especially if you're trying to design propellers. You want to make sure that the wing is rotated in the right direction. We can also look at the pilot here. Now, if you zoom in, you'll see these feet sticking out. That is basically the game saying that the pilot is facing up in the vertical direction here, and that tells us that our pilot is oriented in the right direction. And last but certainly not least, of all the tools available to you in the Craft Designer is the Design Info panel. Now, this is a docked window over here, the right side of the screen, and that gives you all the different data you would want on the craft as a whole, but also the part or stage that you're currently editing. For instance, right now it's just telling me things like price, mass, and the dimensions and part count of the craft we're working on. The other thing that the Design Info panel gives us is our staging analysis. The staging analysis basically lets us look at all the different relevant numbers for how our craft is going to perform. Things like delta phi, ISP, our starting thrust to weight ratio, our ending thrust to weight ratio, how long the engine will burn for, how many engines we're going to have, how much thrust those engines are going to have, and the total mass of propellant in our stages. And we can break this down for the whole rocket or for individual stages. We can also look at specific details for the part we've selected. In this case, we're looking at the fuel tank, and it tells us fuel type, how explosive that fuel is, and how much it weighs. We can also look at engines and get things like thrust, efficiency, mass flow, exhaust velocity, nozzle area ratio, exit pressure, air pressure, and power use. Now, the last tab we have is our crew assignment. If you're building a manned rocket and you want to assign crew to that rocket, you can go here, go to the crew assignment, and you can select the crew member you want and drag it into the space capsule. The other way you can assign crew to a rocket is by going to the command tab and physically grabbing and slapping a Druid onto the command capsule. When you connect a Druid to any part that has a crew compartment, it automatically adds that crew member to the crew compartment. And then you can go to the part properties and remove that character at a later time if you want. If you did, go ahead and leave a like down below the video and put a comment down on what you think I should cover next in this tutorial series. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Stay safe out there and keep on building.